All right, so welcome back, folks. Here we are going to get started on Chapter 30, The Crisis of Authority. It covers a lot of stuff, and actually, the content of this chapter takes us really to modern America. So we're really, in terms of a time frame here, talking from about 1960 really to about 2010, if you want to be totally honest with some of the concepts that we'll be hitting up in here and some of the ideas, focusing primarily today on the environment, kind of the youth culture, the counterculture movement of the 1960s, and the women's movement, which were all really important pieces to the puzzle in the changing America of the 1960s and 70s primarily, and the outcomes of those changes and efforts certainly can still be seen and are relevant today. So let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to go ahead and say I think this one will be a little bit shorter. I'm going to say it, but as we know, we'll see how that turns out. So anyway, first off, let's talk a little bit about the women's movement beginning in the 1960s. So women had kind of been, for lack of a better term, quiet for a while, ever since the 1920s, right? Women got the vote, and it was a great achievement with the 19th Amendment in 1920, getting to vote for the first time. And if you remember from chapter 22, we talked about women like Margaret Sanger and Alice Paul that talked about contraception and equal rights and things like that. But the culture of the 1920s kind of buried that a little bit as women expressed themselves as flappers and more sexuality and stuff like that. And then the bigger problems of the 30s and 40s, the Great Depression and then World War II, kind of made not only a women's movement, but any sort of movements in general for equal rights and things amongst any minority group, gender or ethnic or racial or otherwise, kind of take second fiddle. And of course, when the war was over in 1945, women, though they had made advancements in terms of employment and stuff like that in the war years, are more than happy to kind of, backtrack themselves into the more domestic roles as mothers and housewives. And this all begins to change in 1960, largely because of this woman, Betty Friedan, who was a college graduate from an all girls school, Smith College, in 1947, wrote what turned out to be kind of the Bible of the women's movement, a book called The Feminine Mystique. And in this book, Betty Friedan, whatever, writes about how women and as housewives have kind of lost themselves in their efforts to kind of, be housewives and be at home and that sort of thing. Basically, it suggests that educated women ultimately had become bored with their lives as housewives and needed some outlet, something to do with their lives to feel more fulfilled. And this really helped spawn the feminist movement in the 1960s. Friedan gets this information. She goes around and talks to and interviews the women that she had gone to college with back in the 40s. And we're like, hey, are you happy with your life and the things you're doing and stuff like that? And she discovered that, yeah, women didn't feel fulfilled intellectually or socially and were just kind of caught in the trap of being, these suburban housewives. And this, again, gives kind of a rebirth to the whole concept of the women's movement, which gets going again here now in the 1960s and has really kind of continued ever since. Okay, by the mid 1960s, here's another acronym for you: women organize the America's largest feminist organization, the National Organization for Women, whose goals are similar to goals of groups like the NAACP and other groups that pursue civil rights activism, except here they're pursuing activism and opportunities for women. The women's movement in the 1960s does see some ultimate success. as women pursue more opportunities, you start to see more women going to college again, which had kind of dipped off a little bit in the 1950s. You start to see women start to play more prominent roles politically and socially again, which they hadn't really since the 1920s and 30s, since Roosevelt was president. And you see, you know, long-term changes, such as things like when we talked about affirmative action. Obviously, that benefits women. Title IX, which deals with women's athletics and opportunities there, that comes around in the early 1970s, and other laws and acts that are generally beneficial to pursue more equal opportunities and rights for women. And this is all attributed and started here by Betty Friedan during the 1960s. Now, the women's movement kind of hits the snag a little bit as it starts to get a little bit too radical. And this, of course, turns off more conservative women, more conservative people that say, maybe we're taking it a little bit too far. For instance, there was a movement by a group of women in the 1970s to have the spelling of the word woman changed to WOMYN so it didn't contain the word man in it. Women that didn't take care of personal hygiene is kind of an affront to man and their sexuality. You see a growth, at least publicly, of same-sex female relationships, lesbian relationships, grow more common in the 1960s and 70s, and a lot of that is, a response to these radical women that kind of shun the whole concept of being attached to men because they feel, and for whatever reason, that it limits or stunts their opportunity for personal growth. That's a little bit too radical, and it hurts the women's movement through the 1970s. Somebody who really jumps on the bandwagon of this movement is a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. Now, in 1972, an Equal Rights Amendment is proposed to the Constitution that initially has a lot of support to make, an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution to provide for and ensure equal rights for women. Phyllis Schlafly is an older woman who believes more in traditional roles of women. And she emerges in the 1970s kind of just along at the same time as a new conservative tide is building in America that is a response to the kind of the liberalism of the 1960s with the civil rights movement and the youth culture that we'll talk about in a little bit, and all that stuff. And Schlafly, who, I'm going to go ahead and call kind of Phyllis Schlafly and the ERA stuff here. This is going to be super important AP point number 31. Okay, Phyllis Schlafly is an important figure because she is the antithesis of kind of the women's movement. She believes in, the old roles of women, the cult of domesticity and Republican motherhood, and brings about this new conservative ideal that, this women's movement has had a negative effect on the family dynamic, has had a negative effect on America socially, and women need to kind of step back to play more traditional roles, which is more fulfilling and where they belong. That these women libbers, as Phyllis Schlafly calls them, are more of a danger and more of a detriment to our society than they are beneficial to opportunities for women. And she gains quite a bit of support too, as there are a large portion of women that say, the hygiene thing, the not shaving your armpits or shaving your legs or whatever, and the whole changing the spelling of woman and all that stuff is going a little bit too far. And this really hurts the Equal Rights Amendment. Initially in 1972, when it gets proposed, it has a lot of support. But a constitutional amendment has 9 years to gain ratification in the required 38 states, and the Equal Rights Amendment never gets there, and it dies in 1981-82, having not gotten enough states to ratify to add it to the Constitution. So the Equal Rights Amendment for women basically dies there. And of course, then you've got the whole Roe v. Wade issue, which ultimately, and we know enough about Roe v. Wade, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But of course, the legalization of abortion, which, sidebar, the Catholic Church, of course, does not support abortion or any such activity. Natural family planning and pro-life ideologies are certainly the crux and belief of our Catholic faith. However, from a historical perspective, Roe v. Wade is an important decision. 1973 is again the result of efforts by women in the 1960s and early 70s. Okay, but to a lot of people, the concept of abortion and the ideology behind this movement is so controversial that it really kind of sticks it kind of puts a little wall kind of, I guess, in the way of further progress for the women's movement, as a lot of people that maybe supported the movement take a more conservative approach with this and say, yeah, maybe we've gone just a little bit too far here. And that kind of hurts the progress of the women's movement, at least to some degree here. Nevertheless, in the long term, the women's movement of the 1960s helped spawn gains made by women later on, right? Women in sports now, the fact that there's more women in college now than men, the fact that you have, women's professional sports that are growing in popularity, like soccer and the WNBA, as well as, the fact that we've had a female major party candidate for president with Hillary Clinton, like her or not, in 2016, and now that we have a female vice president in Kamala Harris, all owe some of that progress, or a good portion of that progress, to the efforts that began way back in the 1960s in the women's movement that was in part spawned by Betty Friedan. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. And I mentioned a little bit before the youth culture of the 1960s. There was a little bit of a youth culture in the 1950s, but the youth culture really blows up in the 1960s, and it has been around ever since. Youth culture is a result of the fact that by the mid to late 1960s, all those baby boomer children are coming of age. And since they're coming of age now, they represent a big portion of the population. For the first time, more than half of the country's population, or something like that, was under the age of 30 by 1970 or some number like that. I'm not exactly sure. But what this movement, or what this change represents amongst the youth of this new generation, who have grown up in an America very different than the America of their parents and grandparents. Their parents were the ones that fought in World War II and were the heroes of this conflict. And like we talked about last chapter, with the challenges of the Vietnam War and how it was very hard probably for a lot of these soldiers whose fathers fought in World War II to live up to that ideal, the children here of this greatest generation, the people that fought World War II, who were people that followed orders, that worked hard, that did all these things, represent something very different. Okay? While their parents, the generation before, tended to, work in factories and manufacturing jobs and things like that, we see, especially beginning in the 1970s and late 1970s and throughout the 80s, the big decline in manufacturing jobs in the United States. And that's important to note. Manufacturing jobs, you can't read that. Manufacturing jobs really go on the decline. It's time, once we get to like the 80s and beyond, as people seek more personal fulfillment. Why do they seek this personal fulfillment? Well, you've got more people going to college. People go to college, they surround themselves with other people with similar ideas and beliefs, and what they seek is kind of this sort of personal freedom, this personal liberation that represents to them something more of, a meaning of life, so to speak. freedom from their parents, freedom to be different. Kids from previous generations didn't really seek these things. They listened to their parents. They knew when the time came they were going to have to go out and work so they could start a family of their own. That was the natural process of life. But in the America of the later 20th century, it's a very different thing. What these kids are often referred to as the New Left. This new group of democratic youth, and the baby boomer children by and large tend to be more liberal, more democratic. You have groups like the Students for a Democratic Society, and these groups are encouraged and inspired, by you can't read that. What am I doing? By the civil rights movement. They see the changes that happen in the civil rights movement and say, what about other things? What about other problems that exist in this country? Let's pursue some changes in these areas and some different things in these areas as well. If it worked in the civil rights movement, why can't we change other aspects of life to fit more of what we want? And that becomes kind of a big part of the ideal of this newer, younger generation. And that's kind of what the New Left is about. Now, again, this is not an absolute. I always talk about absolutes. This is not an absolute. There's still plenty of kids out there that are more conservative, that have more conservative ideals and are going to pursue a life along the lines of the examples left by their parents. Okay? But the youth culture of the 1960s certainly stands out. What impacts that culture? More people going to college, protests in college regarding civil rights, regarding Vietnam, regarding rights for other groups, Native Americans, women, homosexuals, all kinds of different groups. So you see all over the country, college campuses have their fair deal of campus unrest, protest, and challenges that previous generations just didn't pursue. Okay, the youth culture of the 1960s, or the counterculture movement of the 1960s, is unlike anything we'd ever seen before. What factors present themselves in regards to this? Well, for one of the big cultural pieces that affect kind of the counterculture movement is, of course, rock music, rock and roll music. Rock and roll was relatively harmless in the 1950s when Elvis arrived, even though people looked at it like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. But by the 1960s, rock and roll continues to grow in popularity, and young people emulate the popular rock stars of the day, whether it's the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or folk singers like Joan Baez or Bob Dylan. And as these singers embrace things like drugs, embrace things like, more, I guess, Buddhist type Eastern religious beliefs, that affects the perceptions of the youth of this era. And that's kind of where the hippies come from. Now, hippies by nature, the true hippies, really don't want to be a part of the greater society. They think society is morally and socially bankrupt. They think politics has ruined everything. They think Vietnam is bad and all this other stuff. The true hippies kind of leave society behind and go live in communes where they practice things like free love and eat off the land and do a lot of drugs and stuff like that. But, and that's a big part of the counterculture movement. But their style, like their clothing, their eccentric clothing, their attitudes, their drug use gets adopted by the culture at large and gets mixed in with the popularity of this rock and roll music of the era, and it creates this really powerful, influential youth culture, unlike anything our country had ever had before. And obviously, the pinnacle moment of this counterculture movement was, the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. where everybody in the world seemingly went to this little place in New York and went to this music festival with hundreds of thousands of people, and it was crazy with drinking and drug use and um, other crazy things going on there that I can't really talk about. Uh, that was the counterculture movement. There was Woodstock '99, where everybody in the world was at the um, DMX concert. Rest in peace, Earl Simmons. Come on. What? Um, but anyway, uh, this movement, really kind of like the civil rights movement has its peak at the "I Have a Dream" speech by Martin Luther King. The counterculture movement kind of has its pinnacle moment at Woodstock, and after that, things dissipate a little bit as we head into the 1970s, and we have other new sets of problems. But the counterculture movement is typified by, the hippies and drug use, this pursuit of kind of seeking a life that's personally fulfilling rather than fulfilling the wants of society. Okay, I hope I'm not rambling too much, but basically, look, the parents, the greatest generation, as they're called, the parents of these people lived a life where life wasn't about personal fulfillment. Life was about fulfilling responsibilities. Okay? Life was about, if you're told to do something, you do it, and that is the ethically and morally right thing to do. Well, the children of these people, the youth culture of this era, their perspective on life is more find personal fulfillment. If you don't want to go fight in a war in Vietnam because you don't believe in it, don't go fight the war in Vietnam. Dodge the draft. It's ideas and beliefs like that that kind of define this era relative to how the older generations had looked at personal responsibility. So hopefully that makes sense. Um, just give you an idea, women in the workforce, how it has grown and represented over time. Pretty consistent growth, but if you notice by the year 2000, almost half of the total workforce is female, which sounds about at least closer to right, considering the fact that more than half the population is female. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about today is the environmentalist movement. So the environmentalist movement is kind of spawned in the 1960s as a result of a book called Silent Spring by a woman named Rachel Carson. This, like the Feminine Mystique, is the Bible of the women's movement. This is the Bible of the environmental movement. In this book, Rachel Carson talks about how the dangers of modern society are plaguing the future of our environment. For instance, as people move out into the suburbs and trees and land and natural areas are cut down to build new houses, where do the animal populations and vegetation populations of these areas go, and the damages that creates? Pesticides that are used to kill mosquitoes and things, the damages that does to birds and other animals that live in these areas. This is something that we had never really thought about all that much. The threats that modern technology has on the environment. Environmentalism, or the environment, had always been kind of tied up to conservation movements, right? We talked about conservation movements before. If you remember John Muir, the Hetch Hetchy controversy, and the Sierra Club, and groups like that were focused on around the turn of the century on, maintaining and keeping pieces of land because of their natural beauty. They didn't really give a whole lot of consideration to the damage that new technologies, and the growth in population and people moving to the suburbs and stuff like that are doing to the environment. And there turns out to be quite a bit of damage that is being done to the environment. One of the things actually that really alerts people to the environmental problems was the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, which caught a massive fire in 1969. Literally, the river caught on fire. Rivers are made of water, but it was so filled with pollutants and petroleum waste that on a sunny day, one time the whole river, kind of just goes up in flames, and people are like, "Well, this should not be possible. This shouldn't be happening." And by the 1970s, it turns people's minds to we really have to do something about protecting the environment. What damage is the waste from the pollution from factories doing to the climate? What are we doing with some of the waste that we have? What are we going to do when we run out of landfills? This is where concepts like recycling really come from. There wasn't really recycling before the 1970s. Okay, this is a new concept created in the 1970s, and we also get the creation of the Environmental Protective Agency. All these things were created by President Richard Nixon and have grown increasingly important since then, as the problem of the environment obviously is still a hot button issue today. But again, it all goes back to the 1960s and the 1962 book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson that kind of leads the movement towards the realization that something has to be done about our environment. And if we don't do something to protect and preserve the environment, we're going to be, I can't read that, that's 1962. We're going to be in serious jeopardy, in the long term. To some degree, we've adapted to those ideas and said, okay, let's do something about it. But obviously, there's a lot of pushback from some groups that think the environmental issues are something that aren't as much an issue as some people make it out to be. But in any event, we see this concept of environmentalism, recycling, the Environmental Protective Agency. The world's first Earth Day was in April of 1970. So all this movement, all this push for environmental change, really born, out of the many movements of the late 60s and early 70s. People, as the civil rights movement and other movements kind of start to take a, back seat, the new big movement of the 1970s in many ways is what are we going to do to protect our environment? So anyway, that is going to be it for this lesson today, and we will see you next time. All right?